Welcome to our Sussex Federal Election Show. I'm Brett James, Principal of Sussex Strategy Group, and I'm joined this morning by Marco Mendicino, MP for Eglinton-Lawrence and the campaign co-chair for Ontario for the Liberal Party of Canada campaign. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here with you, Brett.
Thanks. I want to take the opportunity when we have somebody closely connected with the campaign to talk about where the party sees things today, what the opportunities are in Ontario, what the factors are in Ontario, where some of the issues are going to play, and that's why I want to spend a little bit of time on that this morning. Maybe off the top, if there's one signature issue for this government and for this party going into the campaign, it seems to be climate change and action on the environment. It's strong for the party brand. It's been a key focus over the last few years. But mixed with that, you've got Green Party, which has always had credibility on the issue. You've got the NDP, who have always made the environment a strong part of their own platforms. And then you've got what are, I think, is a factor is issues of affordability when it comes to things like carbon tax and what depending on what Canadians need to pay and what they get back in their pocket, how that plays into the CPC hands and Andrew Scheer. So how do you see that issue in particular playing in Ontario, since you're focused on Ontario?
Well, yeah, and look, I mean, I'd begin by saying that climate change and the need to tackle it shouldn't be a partisan issue. I know you've done a bit of a quick synopsis of each of the different parties' positioning on it, but it's not the Liberal Party of Canada that's making this an issue of national concern. It's the science and the evidence. And back in 2015, we did talk about climate change. We talked about the need to take very serious steps towards addressing it. And one of the very first things that we did once taking government in 2015 was to participate in COP21 in Paris. And at the time, the consensus of experts and folks who studied the issue very closely were three basic principles. One, climate change is real, global warming is happening. Two, it's being caused by human activity. And three, as a result of those two things, we need to take some decisive action to reduce GHG emissions or carbon pollution. And so out of that came our commitments, Canada's commitments to aim to reduce significantly our GHGs to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Since then, there have been additional studies put out, for example, by the IPCC, which was just released last fall, which have underlined the growing urgency of the issue, which really reaffirms the importance for us to adhere to those targets, to adhere to our COP21 goals. In many ways, Canada is being affected and impacted by climate change more rapidly and more intensely than other countries. And if you follow the evidence, we're actually heating up much more quickly than many other countries, almost twice as fast as many other countries on average. So that's a challenge. But out of that challenge comes the opportunity. And what we have put together is a serious plan. Now, there's a lot of focus that is put on a price on pollution, what some of our opponents call a carbon tax. There's a reason why they use the word tax. And the courts in Canada have recently helped, I think, in a very clear and lucid way, cut through some of that noise. But it's not just about putting a price on pollution. It's about taking some other decisive steps, for example, in powering past coal. It also involves taking aggressive steps towards making Canada a global leader when it comes to green tech and innovation, which is part of tapping into a $1 trillion opportunity to create jobs and growth. It also involves taking steps with regards to our infrastructure, and that's my portfolio right now as the parliamentary secretary, so that we can green our fleets. And one of the things that we recently did right here in Toronto was to launch the first new 60 e-buses which will be part of a plan to get to net zero, because we know that transportation is one of the main contributors, if not the most significant contributor to our overall pollution footprint. So it's stitching these different policy prescriptions together as part of a comprehensive plan. I didn't refer to it, but I will now. We're also taking, I think, a number of important steps towards protecting our environment. In fact, doubling the footprint of our areas which we're going to protect, particularly around our coastlines and our marine habitat. So when you look at all of these components put together, you see a plan that is serious, that strikes the right balance to meet the ambitious goals that we have to, in order for Canada to play the leading role that it must on the global stage to do our part towards reducing the overall pollution footprint. On the other side of the ledger, you've got our opponents. Now, there are a number of conservative premiers who have chosen not to participate in our climate action plan and are looking for other ways to litigate this in court. There have been 2 court decisions which were recently released, one by the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal and one recently here in Ontario by the Court of Appeal. And in both of those cases, the courts found that our plan, our climate action plan, which includes putting a price on pollution, is perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional, and perhaps most importantly, is a necessary and essential feature of any serious plan when it comes to tackling climate change. I think that the premiers are recalibrating a little bit in the wake of those 2 decisions. I was in Saskatoon last week to be present for the Premier's Conference. And while I think at the outset there was some anticipation that the so-called resistance of a handful of provinces, Alberta, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Manitoba, that they would come out sort of hitting very hard, doubling down on their strategy to litigate this in court. What I heard was a more moderated tone, and in fact, Premier Higgs decided to pull out of his own province's constitutional challenge to our federal plan, which I think is a bit of a bellwether on just the overall reading of the tea leaves in not only how this is going in court, but also in terms of how the public feel about it. And so the one thing I have noticed anecdotally is that whereas in 2015, I may have spent some time at the doors explaining to people what the impacts are of climate change, in 2019, I no longer need to do that. We're no longer having to explain what the adverse consequences are of not taking decisive action on climate change. We see it in extreme weather events, whether it's forest fires, droughts, century floods, which are occurring now every couple of years. These things are being seen and reported. The melting of the rapid melting of our polar caps. People feel it. Canadians feel it, and so I think that there has been a real decisive change in overall attitudes that I've noticed, which is giving us, I think, the support that we need to maintain this plan and to take the serious action that's necessary.
Yeah, I think you're right. The evolution of the issue has meant that really there's not much challenge anywhere that it is an issue that needs to be addressed. It's how we address it then that becomes the issue at hand. So in Ontario, I was talking to my colleague Devin McCarthy in one of our previous shows, and he raised the issue that there was polling done that showed, I think earlier this year, 61% support in Ontario for the need to get our resources moving and for pipelines in general. Mm-hmm. And the same 61 just last month, supporting the decision on TMX. Mm-hmm. So and why I want to focus on Ontario is if you've got general support for climate action, we need to do more for the environment, but you also have a majority supporting the need to move our resources. How is that playing at the door? And do you think that your governments and what the party's promising to do should it be reelected, is finding that balance between resource development and environmental action.
I do, and we've always spoken about the need to balance the needs of tackling climate change with also growing our economy. And while our opponents seem to be caught between the two extremes of those two important priorities for Canadians, we've always attempted to balance the competing interests, which I think are necessary when you have a country which is as vast and as diverse in terms of its regional economic strengths, as well as how certain parts of the country are feeling disproportionately the impacts of climate change. When it comes to approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline, we've seen this as a project which is in the national interest. It's a project which does straddle provincial boundaries, and therefore we have properly asserted the federal jurisdiction to approve the pipeline. At the same time, we've also taken into consideration what are the potential impacts on our ability to meet our COP21, our commitments on climate change. And we've also, for example, made extensive efforts and meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples who would be impacted along the proposed pipeline route. It's very encouraging to see that Indigenous communities are becoming much more engaged, and far from there being any sort of one uniform position that reflects Indigenous peoples and their position with regards to this pipeline, we see a diversity of views, and we see that Indigenous leaders are now wanting to step forward and potentially put forward a proposal to buy the pipeline, which I think is an important step towards reconciliation, and will also provide economic opportunities for Indigenous communities. At the same time, helping to leverage our energy and resources sector, which remains a vital part of our economy, in particular for Alberta, where we know over the last several years there have been some real headwinds challenged. So it's about balancing those important economic objectives while at the same time continuing to stay on track with our climate commitments. Now, having said that, I know that you have alluded to how our Conservative opponents, for example, have raised questions around affordability and can we afford to take the steps that we have put together in our climate action plan. I think we've got several answers to that question. The first is that we can't afford not to take the steps that we are taking, that if we don't find ways to transition to cleaner fuels, for example, or if we don't look for ways to power past coal, that the impact on the overall health of Canadians will continue to be challenged and potentially deteriorate. And so it is in our interest, it is in our economic and public health interests to be looking for newer, cleaner ways to be moving ourselves, to be transporting ourselves, to be getting our goods to market. The second thing that I would say in answer to the criticism that we receive from Conservatives in particular around affordability is, what's your plan? And we waited a long time for Andrew Scheer to release his plan, and he didn't want to submit it to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Fine. But other folks have already started to study the plan, and again, what we're hearing from experts in the area who are not partisan is that Andrew Scheer's plan, like Doug Ford's plan, will do less to reduce pollution, and it will likely cost Canadians and Ontarians more. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that neither of the two plans includes putting a price on pollution, whereas ours does. And the purpose of including a price on pollution is to reflect that there are prices and costs which are incurred as a result of not taking the action, as I've already mentioned, but it's also net neutral. It's whatever revenues we generate from that climate action incentive rebate, as we've called it, will go right back into the pockets of Canadians, as well as business and industries who we partner with to meet this challenge.
So I want to move on from climate, and you mentioned, in your portfolio as parliamentary secretary, it's infrastructure, and something that we've been seeing, and I'm curious, and I want your take on this. There have been, and I'm expecting more, significant investments in infrastructure announced in Quebec. And in my view, this election comes down to Quebec and what happens there, and 905 in southwestern Ontario. Where are all the announcements for Ontario?
Well, first, I would say that we've made significant progress on the infrastructure file, and I think we've approved in excess of 4,800 projects total in the last 3.5, nearly 4 years. By comparison, under the last Conservative administration, we have dramatically accelerated and added to by more than 4 times the amount of infrastructure projects which were approved under the last government. So, on any objective comparison, I think we're doing better than under the last Conservative government. There has been some delay incurred in Ontario. Those delays have really added up over the course of the last year. Now, to be fair to Premier Ford, part of that delay can be attributed to transitioning into government. And so anytime there's a new government that takes the reins, you need some time to recalibrate your priorities, to set your program, and to put it into implementation. We're now over a year and a half, and the way the federal government has put into effect its infrastructure plan is to roll out what we call the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan. This is a 12-year plan with $180 billion plus allocated to a number of different streams. There is a stream which is dedicated to transit, a stream that is dedicated to social or cultural recreational infrastructure, a stream dedicated to green infrastructure, a stream dedicated to the transportation corridor, so big international bridges and roads. And then finally, there is a new stream which we unveiled, which is dedicated to rural and northern communities. And that was a stream which we created in response to the overwhelming need to put some additional focus and some support into communities which perhaps don't have the same degree of resources that other large urban or suburban centers have when it comes to their tax base in order to contribute to some of these big projects. In order to get access to that $180 billion, we need partners. And in particular, we need the provinces to step up and to consult with cities, towns, municipalities that are within their jurisdiction and to put forward projects. In Ontario, we've had a challenge doing that in large part because the province has not put forward an intake process in all of the streams, and there are still some streams in Ontario which are not open. So, for example, the green infrastructure stream is not open, and that presents a real challenge when it comes to accessing those federal dollars so that we can make announcements which will help Ontarians mitigate against the potential risk for flooding, fires, and other potential adverse impacts around climate change. We have seen some movement on other streams, for example, in the rural and northern stream, but only very recently and well into the construction season. And of course, then there's the Ontario Line project. Now, there's a couple of important points that I want to make about this so-called proposal, which the Premier released a little while back. First is, again, it came well into the construction season for 2019. So even assuming there was a serious proposal that was on the table for the federal government to consider, very likely we wouldn't be seeing any procurement, again, which would be the responsibility of the province and the partnering cities until next year, which is unfortunate. It's a missed opportunity. But secondly, we got a 2-page proposal for a $28 billion plan where, in contrast to other jurisdictions, for example, in British Columbia and in Quebec, we've gotten proposals which are well costed. They're backed by evidence. They're backed by a consensus among municipal leaders. We don't have that here in Ontario when it comes to this particular project. And so what we have said is come back with a serious plan and we'll be happy to work with you. The money is there. In fact, there's over $8 billion allocated for Ontario Transit alone. Those dollars can't get unlocked unless we've got a serious plan, and we're still waiting to hear from the Premier and from his team on that.
You don't want to just make some unilateral announcements before an election and then let them figure it out after?
Well, no, that's not the way we should be building infrastructure. I mean, it may be very tempting, but you know, the challenge with taking that kind of an Ottawa knows best approach, and it's funny, you know, Andrew Scheer had a bit of a Freudian slip on that a little while back when he gave a speech. You know, we all make those mistakes, but the reality is that if Ottawa imposed its vision of transit or any other infrastructure priority on provinces or on communities, that there would be lurch from one mandate to the next. And that's not the way that you build a country. The way that we believe we should be building infrastructure is through cooperation and through collaboration. Now, that's not to say that we haven't matured the relationship between the federal government, the bilateral relationship that exists between the federal government and cities and municipalities. So, for example, we doubled the gas tax fund, or what we called the municipal top-up infrastructure fund this year in budget 2019. I've crisscrossed this province, and there were many smiles on mayors and other stakeholders because the doubling of that fund would grant them the greatest amount of latitude to use those federal dollars directly on infrastructure needs as the cities and municipalities identified it. We also have been partnering with third parties like the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, through the administration of the Green Municipal Fund. And that has allowed us to do things like in Toronto, announce the expansion of the bike share program, which is a great way to, you know, at this time of year in particular, when there isn't a lot of snow on the ground, for people to get around town. And it's really encouraging to see right here where your offices are located, the densification of that program, lots of green share bikes. I'm sure you've noticed the expansion yourself. So we are looking at ways to promote cooperation and collaboration with provinces, but we've also been very responsive to cities and municipalities who've asked us to find ways to partner directly.
So as Ontario co-chair, I'm sure you're part of or directing some of the strategy discussion on where to focus resources, where the major battles are going to be. We have a sense, and we look at, you know, where was close last time, who's got the strong new star candidates, how are certain issues playing in certain places. So, you know, my preface would be we've got a Liberal Party that has taken some hits in the early part of this year over ethics issues like SNC-Lavalin. We have recently started to see that come back a little bit, and so depending on which poll you want to look at, the party's either up a little bit or down a little bit, so we'll call it very close. The NDP has kind of disappeared in Quebec, and that's a major factor there. Still strong in parts of Ontario for sure, and Andrea Horwath, as the opposition leader in Ontario, had her strongest showing just a year ago. And the Greens are stronger across the country. So where you look at these various factors and where the party's strengths are there particular spots in Ontario that the party's focused where it knows it needs to either shore up its support or where there's opportunity for gains in Ontario as you try to maintain a majority or at least maintain power?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you may recall, we won 80 seats in Ontario in 2015, and you know, roughly a third of our overall size of our caucus. And, you know, we hope to hold those seats and grow. And I think that there is absolutely a path in which we can do that. Part of the reason why I say that is that we have a very solid economic record on which we are running. Over 1 million jobs created over the last 4 years, unemployment which is at record lows, you know, GDP growth which, you know, I think has actually exceeded expectations. And although I know at times we hear, you know, the typical sort of conservative complaint, concern, however you want to describe it, around spending, when you actually take a look at the numbers, our deficit is at about 0.5% of our overall GDP and going down, where, for example, by contrast, if you look at the United States annual deficit spending, they're at 5% of their GDP and going up. And so I think we have demonstrated to Ontarians and to Canadians more broadly that we are responsible stewards of the economy. And the reason why I think our agenda has worked successfully thus far is because we are making responsible investments like in infrastructure, as we just discussed, where we're seeing lots of projects approved. And these are not boondoggles, these are serious projects which are helping to meet the serious challenges of the province. Transit, building, housing. Toronto, for example, has got a wait list of nearly 100,000 folks who need access to affordable housing. We've got a national housing strategy which is going to reduce homelessness by half over the next dozen years. These are really, really substantive policies which are tangibly impacting the quality of living in Ontario. We've made also very, very significant progress in reducing poverty as it relates to children. Over 300,000 kids now no longer going hungry, close to 1 million Canadians out of poverty. These are some of the promises that we made in 2015, which allowed us to win 80 seats, and we're able to go back to the electorate now and say, we've delivered. The choices will be, I think, very clear. You've got Andrew Scheer, who quite frankly, when again, nonpartisan folks are looking at some of his unveils as it relates to the economy, they see it as a throwback to the 1990s, if not earlier, like literally reflecting a kind of Reaganomics. It's a bit baffling to me how it is that he plans to drive growth. What we do know is that if he were to assume the reins of power, the agenda would probably look an awful lot like Doug Ford's, in that there would be a lot of cuts to essential services, whether it's in health, education, long-term care, on the backs of the Canadians who need those access to those services the most. That has led to a lot of recent criticism, in many instances, I think, quite justified. And although it is not the federal government's role to backstop every provincial cut that has been implemented over the course of the last 6 months or so, we are taking action where we need to. And another example, for example, on climate change. Doug Ford decided that he was going to cut tree cutting. He was going to make cuts to tree planting. We know that tree planting is an important measure that can be taken to help reduce pollution because of carbon capture. So the federal government stepped in there. We also want to work very closely with our friends in the labor sector, and we know that the way Conservatives tend to be positioned on working with unions is much more adversarial. And some of the very first things that we did when we took government in 2015 was to rescind the union-busting legislation, which had been introduced by Stephen Harper during his last mandate. So how does this translate into...
Give me one riding that's a bellwether riding that our viewers should be watching on election night.
Well, I'll give you an area, and I think we should be looking very closely at southwestern Ontario. Okay. I think that there are a number of ridings there that went orange, went NDP, where I think, for example, if you're an auto worker in Windsor and maybe you voted NDP, since you can remember, but you're now wondering, where is that party when it comes to supporting NAFTA? You've got a leader in Jagmeet Singh who is really, fighting, I think, with different branches within his party, and is really betwixt and between to articulate a clear position on, for example, building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would be great for the labor sector. He can't find it within himself to talk in any positive terms about NAFTA or any other free trade agreement for that matter. And Canada now boasts an unprecedented relationship with every other G7 partner that we've got. And so if you're that auto worker, in Windsor, and you've voted NDP because it's just always been what you've done, are you now asking yourself, maybe not this time? And I think we're going to have some really serious contenders, some strong candidates in that region who can talk about the progress that we've made with NAFTA, who can talk about how we've lifted steel and aluminum tariffs, who can talk about how we've supported the auto sector with over $5 billion to the big three to ensure that we're keeping as many of those jobs in Canada as possible. That's just one example, but I think we're going to be in play in a lot of different areas as well, including in rural Ontario, in particular along the Eastern Ontario corridor with our investments in digital infrastructure. And I've driven that corridor now from Ottawa all the way back to Toronto and then some. And what I heard from a lot of small town mayors is, don't forget about us. You know, having access to the internet is not just about shopping on eBay. It's about having access to healthcare and education and other critical services. And we can't forget about that last mile. And we recently did an announcement with EORN, which is the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, which would invest in digital infrastructure. So I think we're going to be very competitive in parts of the province where, you know, maybe people would have written us off a few months back, but we're very much in the game, and I'm very excited by this campaign and looking forward to it.
Thank you. Marco Mendicino, the co-chair for the Ontario campaign for the Canadian Liberal Party. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Brett. Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks.